welcome to the program. Svetlana Onye joins us today. She's a climate justice advocate, writer, journalist, and researcher, and the project lead for the Eco-Anxiety Africa project, which investigates the mental health impact of climate change across Africa and the necessary responses and adaptations communities need. Her journalistic work focuses on the impact of natural resource extraction on communities across the global south. Her literary work earned her selection into the Writers on the Rise program, and she's also founder of Not Actually Radical, an online educational platform that seeks to use accessible education as a tool of liberation across the African diaspora. I thought it was important that we bring on a guest to talk about climate change and, in some cases, geopolitics from an angle that we don't often hear from. Again, the point of this program, for those who've been with us for all these episodes now, has been to ask the questions nobody else is asking, to look at parts of the world that are not getting enough attention, and to cover the topics that are just not being covered well anywhere else. And so the intersection of physical health care, mental health care, a changing global climate, and the sub-Saharan African culture and continent, the intersection of all of these things, I don't think I've really heard talked about extensively in any other program. So we thought it was important to take a moment, think about the intersection of all of these issues, how they're affecting the nations of sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and what that might mean for policymaking internationally and even in your home country as you think about the intersection of resources that come out of Africa that are critical to the global economy, but the impact that that may have on local populations there, as well as the overall climate of the planet. So it's a fascinating topic. Svetlana was very generous with her time. We covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and I really believe this is a conversation you're not going to get anywhere else, certainly not in the depth of what we're doing here. Though Svetlana is a prolific writer, and I have links to all of her work. So as an individual content creator, she's done fantastic work, but sometimes you need the help of an interviewer to bring out a broader variety of the issues and bring them to an audience that might not otherwise encounter some of this work. So I hope you find this interview as fascinating to listen to as I did to conduct. And with that opening note, I present to you my conversation with Svetlana Onye. Svetlana, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So I've given a little bit of a bio, but nobody can introduce themselves like themselves. So for the benefit of our global audience, tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the subjects that we're talking about today.
So my name is Svetlana Chigozie Onye, and I'm a project lead for the Eco-Anxiety Africa project. So I work on investigating the mental health implications of climate change in Africa and what interventions, research, and initiatives need to take place to build resilience as a community. Outside of that, I'm also an environmental journalist where I investigate the impact of natural resource extraction on local communities, on their health, on their ability to self-actualize, and the environmental devastation over the years. And outside of that, I work on writing. I'm a writer as well, and I focus on poetry, literary works, and topics of climate also intersect into that as well.
So let's begin by talking about what you're focused on today. And I think a lot of the issues we're going to cover are not issues covered widely in traditional media. Even new media sometimes misses them. So what are you focused on right now that the rest of the world should be paying attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I'm focused on right now is looking at the intersection of health and climate change. Specifically, mental health is what I do in my work. And I think that it needs to be looked at because when we see around the world that natural disasters are quickly occurring, mental health impact is a residue of that. So that can be depression, that can be anxiety, that can be PTSD. But we don't often include mental health into that discussion. We don't talk about mental health response when we're responding to these situations. And long term, that can have devastating impacts where people are psychologically suffering from climate change, but there isn't the necessary research, policy, or solutions to help them survive from that. Outside of mental health, we're also seeing the impacts of climate change on health, for example, a rise in infectious diseases, the impact of climate change on the quality of vaccinations, for example. And these are all things that if we don't pay attention to, as the years pass by, it's going to be something that will become unavoidable without the tools to really respond to the need that's happening on the ground in the global south, but eventually also in the global north.
So, as we think about some of the challenges that are unique potentially to the African continent, let's say the sub Saharan African continent, what are some of the unique challenges of climate change that those nations are facing, maybe different, separate, or unique from what other nations around the world are dealing with?
Yeah, so those different challenges. So, for example, when we talk about Africa, they only produce 2% of global emissions, but they are disproportionately affected. And that effect can be seen in multiple ways. So, for example, natural resource extraction, it happens heavily in Africa because those minerals are mostly found on the continent of Africa. So, if we talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo as in particular, what we see is that natural resource extraction and the expansion of mines, millions of trees have been cut down, which only means that there's more risks of floods, and agriculture is disrupted, which means increase of biodiversity loss, as well as that because of the nature in which resources are extracted, minerals and toxic waste is poured into the water, which means that in certain regions in the DRC, there's no fishes, but also scientists have found in particular regions where fishes are found, these fishes have traces of mercury and cyanide, which is then digested by the local people. Another unfortunate thing is that because of the expansion of these mines, what we're seeing is mass displacement. In the DRC in particular, 6.9 million people are displaced. And the thing with displacement is rapid urbanization, which means that a lot of people are coming to one area and in order to survive, they're manipulating the land to be able to eat, which means they're using, for example, coal and burning wood and things like that. But also there's poor electricity, poor sanitation, poor water resources. And that stress onto the land and stress onto the people means that there's even more climate change happening in the new areas where people are migrating to. In the sense of Nigeria, where natural resource extraction is happening specifically in the Niger Delta, the impact of climate change on the people in certain regions is that 42 becomes the eldest age for some people. And similarly to the DRC, what we find is those toxic minerals are found in the water, which means people can't drink from the water, people can't fish. So climate change means that fishermen are out of jobs. And as well as that, respiratory illnesses. When I spoke to people for the Niger Delta for a journalism piece I did, he was telling me that you can basically call people in the area smokers, and not because they're actually smoking, but because they're inhaling toxic air pollution every single day. And this inability to really self-actualize because of climate change means more poverty, it means more psychological impact. And as recent reports from both like the World Weather Attribution is saying, is that there's these severe droughts in areas of sub-Saharan Africa will become 100 times more likely. Even the shift to renewable energy will mean a different type of mining, which will have its own climate change implications. So there's a lot of unique experiences on the continent that not only affect the people themselves, but also the human rights of the people on the ground, and also the climate.
So, one of the unique challenges, it sounds like from what you mentioned there, is that all over the world you have individuals, organizations who may be doing things that are harmful to the climate, but at least those people and the people affected are in the same area they're in the same government, there's an opportunity for some balance. But that in Africa's case, a lot of the organizations coming in doing this work, the mining companies, energy companies, they're transnational companies. They have no specific
Hmm.
loyalty to any African nation. So it makes it even more challenging to deal with an issue when the people who are doing the polluting are not in the same community. How are the African governments and non-governmental organizations and rights groups trying to deal with this dynamic of being a source of so much of the world's valuable resources and yet not having a say in really how those are being extracted and what they're being used for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the issue in that lies is because of there's not a clear supply chain. So even if, for example, Apple or um, any company from the UK, for example, is creating gadgets that are from um, natural resources in the Congo, for example, and there's human rights abuses because the supply chain from the mine to the UK is so blurred. You cannot, it's difficult to pinpoint who is the perpetrator, hold people to account, or even create regulatory systems to really ensure that those human rights abuses don't occur. But there's a lot of local communities, a lot of environmental activists on the ground who are trying to really advocate for those supply chains to become clearer. So for me, for example, I spoke to a youth group in the DRC who were speaking about the work that they're trying to do to really raise awareness of women who are being abused in these mines, of the environmental disruption that's happening and the links to conflict when it comes to mines. What's difficult with African governments is that in the case of Nigeria, for example, even though oil has no benefit to the local people, it has monetary benefit for the people and the government themselves. So because it's such a main source of income for the economy, maybe political leaders are benefiting from that and their lifestyles, but the people on the ground aren't. So it's trying to improve the supply chain, improve political corruption, and try to help these African nations also make that transition to renewable energy in a way that meets the needs of people on the ground. So a lot of different things are happening, but unfortunately, because of corruption and because of history, colonial history, and because of the benefits of certain things that has taken place for governments in the West, trying to really change what's happening on the ground can become very difficult.
I'm curious about your view on the coverage now. We'll say in traditional mainstream media around the world, where there is a heightened awareness in recent years about climate change and the issues around it. But now the focus seems to be on the natural disasters that occur in some of the wealthier nations where many of these
Hmm.
news organizations are based, right?
Hmm.
I'm based in the United States, so obviously we have our own fair share of natural disasters here. That gets a lot of coverage here to
Hmm.
some degree. While it's raising awareness, it also seems to be suppressing the stories from around the world in places that don't get as much coverage. So, do you
Hmm.
believe that some of the issues that you have been trying to raise and that those teams have been trying to raise, it's getting harder to get through, even though there might be a more general awareness of the broad issue?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because even when we speak about natural disasters, which are worsening because of climate change, um, in Africa, for example, in certain countries in Africa, when there is a climate disaster, it takes a lot of time to rebuild in comparison to, for example, America. If there's already poor infrastructure, if there isn't the money to pour into healthcare, if there isn't the money to pour into people to rebuild their lives, the suffering is at a complete different scale and the recovery is at a complete different scale. So if we don't focus on that or even recognize that, then what we do is basically erase millions of people's experience. And if we erase those experiences, we can't properly build the solutions to respond to them. Because if we then look at what's happening in America as the sole case study of how to respond to natural disasters, then it will not suit the world in itself, just only one area of the world. And that's why, for example, even when we speak about eco-anxiety, the organization I work for, we speak about it as environmental related emotions. Because for our research, we found that when we speak about eco-anxiety in the global north, their experiences are more fear-based, but actually in the global south, they have experienced natural disasters in extreme measures for years. So their response is more extreme, from suicidal ideation, for example. And if we're trying to build a framework for mental health responses and we're not looking at those severe cases, then once again what we're doing is creating responses that only suit a part of the world who have the facilities, the finance, the researchers, the healthcare to respond in ways that other parts of the world are not able to.
Are there any countries that you're looking at in whether it's Africa or around the world that you think are addressing this issue, this intersection of mental health, environmental issues, climate change? Are there any particular places that are addressing this well, that are incorporating it as part of their policy making, that are engaging with international bodies to try and address some of what you've mentioned here? Or is this still an issue that's a little too under the radar for regulators, policymakers, and others in a position to have an impact?
Yeah, so the intersection of health and climate change is starting to increase the awareness, specifically in UN conference spaces where a lot of international policy, climate policy decisions are made. However, still isn't enough research to really shape these policies, especially with mental health. When we speak about the case of Africa, for example, there's not enough research to really show that intersection and also to show which communities are more vulnerable in comparison to others. Even when we talk about the increase of knowledge in the UN space when it comes to health and climate change, that's still just focused more so on infectious diseases or the impact on vaccinations, things like that. But mental health in and of itself is still not really knowable. And I think that's because when it comes to mental health, it's really based on feeling, it's based on storytelling, and the data to capture that is still emerging. How can we capture that in a way that is not as clear as health, where that can also work with science, for example?
Well, so earlier you mentioned issues around the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Great Lakes region of Africa, which many of our listeners probably know either from geopolitical issues of the past or the natural beauty of the area that is often highlighted on anything from nature programs to people who've had the opportunity to visit. But my understanding is that is one of the areas of the continent that's the most sensitive to climate issues, to pollution,
Mm-hmm.
and where the local population is about as in touch with their local environment as anywhere. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've seen in that region in particular that either those local populations are facing or that have affected that part of Africa's environment?
Yeah, so for example, even in the DRC, there's an increase in landslides, and that can be attributed to the fact that creating these mines, you're manipulating the land a lot, you're changing things around essentially, and that can trigger landslides, which kill people, which means increased fatality, but also it means that it's even harder to rebuild and rehome people who have been displaced due to these climate changes. The same in Nigeria, where we're seeing that studies are basically showing that people who live in places that are manipulated to get oil, there's a higher chance of child immortality in comparison to areas of Nigeria where that's not happening. So we're seeing that there's a lot of death, a lot of illnesses, and a lot of people who are being displaced. And as mentioned before, that can create a rapid urbanization, which means even those who are displaced are suffering in their own ways and will eventually in the long term be vulnerable to even more climate changes, which just creates a cycle. So it's really difficult because what is happening could maybe be responded to better if there was the resources, if climate finance was also addressing the human right casualties that are the cost of climate change rather than just renewable energy. But that is still not happening, unfortunately.
You bring up a good point here about environmental finance and where a lot of the investment dollars have been going. And in so
Mhm.
much of the world, to your point, is investing in technologies that can be adopted by, let's face it, wealthier countries to
Mhm.
maybe change some of those habits. We haven't had as much of a conversation about where the investment will be in mitigating what has already occurred, making countries and nations and cities more resilient to what is
Mhm.
likely to occur, and then, of course, just addressing some of the fundamental challenges, even down to healthcare. So, are you seeing a shift where we're starting to talk about finance in more of that preventative and addressing the issues of today way, or is all the money still pouring into the technologies of tomorrow, which may be who knows how far away in the future before we see the benefits?
Mhm. No, yeah. So I think there's still this increase in speaking about climate finance in the sense of renewable energy and making that green transition. And that's why we see a lot of conversations about carbon markets and carbon credits. But unfortunately, even in Kenya, there's indigenous people who are being displaced so that the Kenyan government can benefit from carbon credits while still releasing fossil fuels. So it's very difficult to see these conversations happen and realize that it's still on the basis of profit, which doesn't mean that it's focusing on people. Because if we remove the fact that there's human rights abuses that happen because of climate change, then things will not change. For example, as you mentioned about resilience, climate finance should also address improving infrastructure so that people can be more resilient to natural disasters, which we know will only increase over the next few years. In the same way, there should be more poured into healthcare so that people who are going to be more vulnerable in Africa, especially to cholera, malaria, and more infectious diseases, will have access to healthcare to really help them to survive. So there's a lot, even to compensate farmers and fishermen who are impacted by climate change and natural resource extraction. And I think one thing that's really important to address through climate finance that I personally haven't seen that conversation happening a lot is that if we make that transition to renewable energy, what's going to happen to the artisanal miners whose main income comes from um, extracting fossil fuels. If their whole family is dependent on that role, then what will happen? How will they transition to be able to survive if they don't have that income anymore? So if we don't address that when it comes to climate finance, then more people will be in poverty, and oftentimes poverty means that there's more crime because people need to do what they can to survive in these areas. So that's an issue that's also not addressed.
Is there one key area of investment that you think could make a big difference in the short term?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think there needs to be more investment into healthcare, improving healthcare, because there's s- too many reports that are showing that natural disasters are only going to increase. And they're showing that the global temperatures are only increasing, the atmosphere is only getting hotter, the ocean surface is only getting warmer. So what we know is that the intensity of hurricanes are going to get worse. The intensity of floods are going to get worse. And that means people will get sicker. And that will happen in the global north as well as the global south. So if there isn't adequate healthcare, then there's going to be more fatalities than there should be, and there's going to be more people who are sick. And if COVID has taught us anything, is that certain diseases can spread nationally, but also internationally. So if we're not focusing on this and also focusing on the prospect of new diseases emerging from climate change and responding to that, then in the next decade we might be in serious trouble when it comes to healthcare.
So, as we think about what the next big conversations are globally, we know we have
Hmm.
these large conferences every couple of years. We
Hmm.
know the United Nations puts this on the General Assembly agenda pretty frequently. But it feels like there's almost been a stalling out, that there's been commitments made, but many of them have not been met, and that the world's attention is starting to shift off to conflicts and into other areas. What are some of the groups out there that are trying to bring this issue back front and center, and where they're trying to focus? Is this something the World Health Organization is focused on and thinking about? Are there other non-UN agencies that are trying to elevate the conversation while it seems the UN is distracted by other issues?
Yes, that's a great question. I think, I think the World Health Organization is trying to help us understand that what is happening. Because even when we speak about conflict, um, the World Health Organization is also making reports that show that conflict impacts climate change, which impacts the health of people on the ground. Then there's other organizations that aren't governmental, like Amnesty International, do really great work and reports and are on the ground, trying to show us the impact of climate change on local communities and also the geopolitics that plays a role in what we're seeing in Africa and even in South America, for example. Then there's also youth groups on the ground. So, for example, in the UK, I'm part of the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and I'm part of the COP working group in particular, where we're trying to make sure that international policies actually reflect the fact that we still want to maintain 1.5, and we still want to maintain that there's a goal of the world of the heat that we want to make sure it doesn't get any hotter, for example, and also um, even youth groups on the ground in Africa and Nigeria are trying to do the same thing. But as you said, conflict can often mean that we get distracted from that, or we don't understand the role climate change plays in that. Because, for example, when I did an investigation into the climate change impacts of the conflict in the Middle East, um, bombs also mean that the heat in the air increase, which means that the temperature changes, biodiversity loss, and in the long term, that means that globally we're all affected. So I think that they're actually intersected, but often in the news they aren't shown in that way.
Earlier, we mentioned that there are often outside forces that affect local populations. And we know that the Chinese government has made a significant investment throughout Africa, both in some cases through infrastructure, in many cases through mineral extraction. This has the echoes of a lot of colonial activity from Western nations in the past. From what you've seen and what you've reported on, the folks you're talking to, um, are you seeing history repeat itself here, or do you feel like there's a chance that maybe this time will be different?
Um, yes, that's such a good question. I think from my own research and interviews, it is history repeating itself. In the DRC, for example, mines that have been created by Chinese companies have been also found to be mines that have some of the worst human rights abuses, um, also underpaid workers, for example, and mine expansions that can often be reported to be made by Chinese companies mean forced displacement, or means that local communities who live around these mines are suffering from air pollution and respiratory illnesses. And oftentimes these exchanges come at a cost. It's not done out of charitable means. And I think it's important to understand why that's happening. If China is coming into these countries and it's at an agreement that can often benefit them more than the African country itself, then it is reminiscent of colonialism, which is why oftentimes when African activists, climate activists talk about that, they talk about it in terms of neo-colonialism.
Are there other countries? I mean, we hear about China, right? And they are one of the large, growing economies of the world. Are there other nations that are also engaged in similar practices that maybe are relative newcomers to the scene in Africa?
Um, from my research, not that I know of, but for example, there are a lot of transnational companies. For example, even oil companies. When we talk about Shell, that's Dutch owned, but also British involvement. And that there's a lot of companies, transnational companies involved, not always able to trace. For example, some of these companies are Canadian, for example. And again, because that supply chain is very blurred of how it was cultivated, these transnational companies aren't always able to be held to account if there is environmental devastation caused by natural resource extraction. And oftentimes we can attribute it to a corrupt government and not actually on the companies who are benefiting from this idea of corruption.
You have the unique benefit of spending significant time in both Western Europe and in Africa. What are the misconceptions that you see on this issue of climate and environmental justice, and even healthcare for that matter, as you go back and forth between the two parts of the world? What does either side not understand about the other that we as citizens and observers should be trying to bridge the gaps on?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think one thing that is important for example, the global north to note is that what is happening in the global south should be really understood so that we know how to globally help the world. Um, as we know that even though a majority of the countries that are contributing the most in terms of global emissions is from the West, the impact is feeling the worst in the global South. So if we're looking at, for example, how to respond to natural disasters, how to respond to healthcare issues, how to even to respond to conflict, and how to respond to food insecurities, we're going to understand how to do that when we research and help people on the ground in the global south. And that means that even when we come to international climate policies, they should be shaped not on the idea of profit, not on the idea of renewable energy, but actually what do these local communities need? Because if we're saying that if renewable energy only thrives in the global north, but then there's a lot of emissions still happening in the global south, then that wouldn't work long term. It means that the world as a whole is not operating in conjunction with one another. And I think when it comes to the global south, I I would say that it's important when we're talking about, for example, loss and damage fund or climate finance, that it should not come as a debt. Because if these finances are being given with the idea that they need to be paid back, then more debt means more corruption, means more instability, and it means that, again, the local people are the ones that are suffering the most. So how can we reach an agreement where these finances are given as grants, for example, without strings attached, so that two parts of the world can thrive and grow together to actually help the environment?
So another element of what's unique about your role and your perspective is that you use various creative forms to get your message out. And we live in a time where media is consumed in ever more fragmented and unique ways, but that creates new opportunities. So my first question around that is, um, how have you tried to use more of a narrative and creative and storytelling approach to get some of what we've talked about here, that on this program, this is sort of what we do, and our audience comes and seeks it, but you're trying to reach audiences for whom they're not seeking out long form interviews around
Hmm.
climate, right? And you're trying to make it more accessible. So tell me a little bit about that process, and what mediums you have found have been helpful, maybe to reach audiences that otherwise well meaning, but this just doesn't cross their social media feed, let's say.
Yeah. I think for me, storytelling and creativity is soft power. We engage with culture all the time, and that's most of the time is reading books or listening to music or things like that. So I definitely try to use poetry as a tool to show what's happening in the climate. I think that that's a powerful tool to engage people in an accessible way, because not, for example, research papers, they have a lot of jargon and complex language, and it's not actually accessible to people who could really benefit from understanding. But storytelling is a way that not only empowers the individual but can empower the person reading it, who realizes, I have a pen, I can write these things too, and I can convey my personal story. Poetry is a big tool. Also, creative writing, creating stories is really important. I think for me as a Nigerian, in our culture, we taught very early on the power of storytelling, the power of stories, and how that can be used also to convey history. And that's why, like, a book that's really famous in Nigeria is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and it basically shows the cultural differences of that occurred because of colonization. And that has been a mantelpiece for me to understand the power of fiction. So even when I created an educational platform in 2021 called Not Actually Radical, I was trying to use that to show how when we look at storytelling, we can understand history, but we can also be the people that shares history. Similarly, my work with the Eco Anxiety Africa project and S2E24, again, that tries to use art as a way to convey what's happening in the world. And when I was interviewing people in the Niger Delta who are environmental activists on the ground, they were also saying they use poetry, they use writing theatre plays and performing that as a way to take agency over their story, but also share it so their community realizes I'm not alone in this experience and I want to do exactly what you're doing with the storytelling.
Is there any particular one of those platforms that you have found is more accessible for people? To give you an example, here in the U.S., a lot of times people try to influence the movies that come out of Hollywood or television shows because it's an easier way to digest a topic within a more entertaining and lighthearted space, but you're still getting points across. But look, fewer and fewer people watch the same movie or the same show, so that is becoming a little bit of an antiquated view. But when you're thinking about your creative writing or your creative platforms, do you find that video, animation, the written word, any one of these formats is breaking through more than the others, or is this a hey, we have to do all of it to reach everybody where they are?
That's a good question. I think video is the best so far from my work. I think even the journalism landscape is completely changing, and digital storytelling is taking more precedent over print. And videos in platforms like TikTok and platforms like Instagram seem to get the most traction, and that's why Reels are really successful as a way to explain complex topics. And also, TikTok has been a really big tool for social activism. So I think video is going to continue to be a really powerful tool to get messages across in bite-sized ways that can be accessible all over the world.
So, as we think about the future, there's plenty to be concerned about, but I'm sure there's also things that you're excited about and organizations that you're covering or individuals that you're looking at that are doing innovative things that are actually setting us up for a more positive, prosperous future. What are some of those topics that you're looking at as your next subjects of either your creative work or your journalistic work that would give our audience some reason for optimism around some of the people and places and things that are trying to address these issues and really make the world a better place?
hmm I think what's really exciting me is a rise in community-based work. I think what can often be overwhelming for us is this idea that change can only happen at the top and governments can only be the decision makers. And that sense of powerlessness can mean we don't take action. So I'm really excited and in love with the work that I see happening in the community where local people are taking action in their own hands. And they're not necessarily trying to create transformation in policy, but just in their peers, in their colleagues and people they care about. So for example, in the work that I do with the Eco Anxiety Africa project, an initiative that we see has the most success is Zen Cafe sessions. So in Lagos or online, we bring people together to just speak about their environmental related emotions. And just having that ability to share that has really helped people find community and not feel as alone. And we use those sessions to also share with people mindfulness or breathing exercises, like resilience coping mechanisms. And it gives us this surge of confidence in realizing that change doesn't have to be a million people. Oftentimes, if you're able to show a young person that breathing exercise, they can show it to their friends when they're at school, they can show it to their parents. And so that ripple of change doesn't always have to be in your view, in your sight, but it's still happening. And I think that that is where generational change can happen. So I think when we start to really focus on making change in our community or helping people in our community, it can give us so much hope because we see that change instantaneously.
The other potential that I think is unique to Africa is it is a place that still has a lot of development in its future, a lot of infrastructure potential. This is part of why outside governments continue to invest, whether they're doing it the right way or not. Is there a sort of a concerted effort that as that development continues, that perhaps this can be the laboratory for the rest of the world to show how you can have development, but do it in a more responsible way, in a more sustainable way? Are there any countries that are focused on this, or any communities that are really trying to build this right from the beginning, knowing that so much of the rest of the world already built their infrastructure for better or worse, and that this is more fertile ground for new technologies and a new way of thinking about development?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And I think that innovation is happening across Africa. So, for example, this year I went to a community-based adaptation conference where a lot of countries from Africa came together to just share what they're doing to adapt to climate change. And it's really innovative things to help with communities having access to clean cooking and like new materials to build clean cookers, or even adapting the way that farmers manipulate the land so that it can mean more things are growing and more things are being sustainable even as the environment changes. So I think that there's so much innovation and so much adaptation that's happening that we will look towards and see and implement in different areas across the world. And I think that that's happening on a community level, but also on a governmental level, civil society, where even donors from the global north are seeing that this is happening. How can we put money to test this? Because if it works here, we know that then we can apply that to our own country.
So, in the name of the storytelling and sharing with audiences, you've obviously done a ton of work in this space. You've done a ton of stories. We'll include links to some of your work so people can go check these things out for themselves. But is there any one that really sticks with you, whether it's a person that you met, an organization you worked with, a story that you covered, that all this time later now you really reflect back on that as either inspiring or just an important story that you think everybody should hear about this, whatever that
Hmm.
subject or person
Hmm.
may have been?
Yeah, so I did an investigation into the impact of natural resource extraction in the Niger Delta, and they've been advocating for justice for 6 decades. And speaking to the environmental activists on the ground was so inspiring because they are maintaining hope, and they're doing that through various ways, even from the older environmental activists trying to fuel that hope in young people so they can carry on the fight, even like using these incredible storytelling practices and teaching young people how to share their stories through poetry, through plays, just various ways. And I think that it shows that helping or gaining justice or gaining respite from natural resource extraction, it won't take one day because unfortunately there's so much profit in it. But there's communities who have this hope and this determination and this real zeal to continue to adapt in order to survive. And I think that that's really important because their story is not unique to them across the world. If we really look at it, there's so many communities who are struggling because of climate change, struggling because of natural resource extraction. Even in America, there's people who will unfortunately struggle to adapt to the impacts of the hurricanes. And there's so many stories of people who have been in that position for decades, and we can cling on to their hope. We can cling on to the things that they've done to adapt, to help us to adapt. And I think that looking at that has really inspired me, and it's something that I carry with my own practices, which is just because the change hasn't happened now doesn't mean that the change won't happen in the future.
If people would like to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to follow along?
So you can either follow along through LinkedIn, which is Svetlana Chigozie Onye, Sanya, and also through Instagram, which is Story of Svetlana. And then the work that I do is the Eco Anxiety Africa Project, but also through LinkedIn, you'll see my journalism work too.
And we'll include links to all of that in the description of this show. It's been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us about this important topic, and we look forward to having you back again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
One of the best things about doing this podcast is you always learn something new. You always gain a new perspective that you hadn't considered before. one of the things that was so interesting to me about this topic when it was presented to me was the idea of healthcare and mental health care in particular. And we've talked about that on this program before, but I hadn't ever really thought about it at the intersection of physical and mental health care and a changing climate. Now, I sort of expected to get into a pretty academic and research-based conversation, but as I did the research for this show and conducted the interview and then reflected on it, it occurred to me that there is an awful lot of anxiety around the world and even in our own backyards, in our own families about climate, but we don't think of it that way, right? We don't think about the anxieties that we have having anything to do with these broader global issues. Somehow we put our anxieties into little micro categories in our own life, and we don't connect them to the broader issues of our society and our culture and our community that might be making them worse. So let me give you an example. I have a number of colleagues and friends and people I've known over the years who have real anxiety about big weather events. Some of them have been through some bad storms as kids or in another time in their life where they did lose everything. They lost a home in a tornado. They lost property in a hurricane. They experienced drought that wiped out their agricultural output for the year. And they have grown up with a lot of anxiety around severe weather, flooding, storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, winter weather events that unfortunately can cut off communities in some parts of the world where the weather gets bad enough long enough. Losing power, losing electricity in the modern world is a huge inconvenience and causes real problems for people in big and small ways. And even in more routine weather events, I have talked to so many folks in the United States, in the Midwest, where we are known for our severe weather, who have real anxiety on those days when there are severe storms in the forecast or there's potential flooding in the forecast because they've seen it and they've experienced it, and they're worried about what it means for their home, what it means for their family, what it means for their safety. Those who work in agriculture, who have farms and ranches, and they have seen extreme weather severely impact their family's ability to continue on with that agricultural work. And then others who maybe are a little more disconnected from the events, but they worry about their family member who lives in a severe weather zone, or they worry about their kids and what kind of planet that they're going to have. I never really thought about this from the perspective of mental health and anxiety, but when you step back and think about all the people in your life who express concerns and worries about things that in the end can be tied back to our climate and our weather, it's pretty breathtaking. And it is soaking up a lot more of our mental space now than it feels like it ever did before. So I invite you all to read more about Svetlana's work. It's very Africa-centric, and so if you don't live in that part of the world or you don't have direct ties there, it's still accessible. It's still something you can take what's happening in that part of the world and make it relevant to your daily life. But I do think it's important that we all focus a little bit more on what's happening in parts of the world that we don't think about, because it is an interconnected planet in more ways than we always appreciate. So one of the goals I have on this show is to remind us of that. I'm not asking you to subscribe to every newsletter that covers the African economy or culture or social issues, but I am suggesting that we take time to think about the parts of the world that we don't see covered in traditional media on a regular basis. There is more to this story of healthcare and climate than what we have in the US or Canada, the UK or Australia, the nations of the Northern Hemisphere, and even as we think about the Southern Hemisphere, the experiences of climate in India are different than those in the Middle East, which are different than those in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa and throughout Latin America. Each of these deserves their own time and consideration, and how we as a global community have to address these challenges because we are all interconnected through travel, through trade, through education, and increasingly through media, including platforms like this. It is a global community. We have to start thinking about it in that context. And conversations like this, I hope, are valuable in advancing the ideas of people who are trying to make their communities a little bit better, one step at a time. The other final point I wanted to make on this topic, specifically the intersection of healthcare and climate. I have been concerned for a long time that an interconnected warming planet is a place that is more prone to infectious diseases. The issue of COVID-19 aside, many of us remember there was a period where we weren't sure how the Ebola virus was evolving in Africa and if it was becoming more contagious and easier to spread across the world. And we actually had a patient who came to the United States a number of years ago, and it refocused this nation's attention on infectious diseases, their spread, where they're originating, and how they're treated. And then once again, it faded to the background. We didn't spend a lot of time in this show on the infectious disease topic because I didn't want to bog down that conversation with scientific laboratory talk. But I do think it's another topic that reminds us how interconnected the world is. And as I think about guests to bring on in future episodes, having that conversation around infectious diseases, I think, is very, very important. The African continent as a whole, with its diversity of people, climates, and environments, has always been an easy ground for any sort of new infectious disease to quickly develop and make its way into the human population, just as much as we see in other parts of the world like China, where we did see COVID-19 emerge, or in India, where we have very, very large populations of people living in very close quarters. Any new infectious disease would be very easy to move through the population. But increasingly, wherever it starts, these things can move very, very quickly around the world. And the warmer the climate is, the easier it would be for these infectious diseases to exist in the air and to move about populations. So not a topic necessarily for this day, but if we think about the intersection of healthcare needs, healthcare infrastructure, and a planet that's likely to need more of it to deal with the things that have largely been suppressed over the last 100 years. Infectious diseases used to kill huge numbers of people. They don't have nearly the effect anymore. But if we have a warming planet and we have more movements of people and we have more opportunity for those viruses to make the jump and then to have an environment that's conducive to their spread, then unfortunately we may be looking at a world that has more infectious diseases that we have to deal with. And do we really have an international healthcare apparatus or even national level healthcare apparatus to deal with emerging diseases when we're already struggling with those that are among us and the non-infectious diseases of mental health challenges and mental health care? Lots to think about. And I don't want to end on a negative or warning note. So I invite you all to follow this program because we have a lot of inspiring guests, and I would consider Svetlana one of those, and so many people who are doing so much good work in this world. And if you follow my episodes leading up to this one, you're going to find some great research, some entrepreneurs, some researchers, some journalists, and some active participants in our world. And I think if you listen to the sum total of all of the episodes of this program, you will walk away as inspired as I am as an interviewer, you will be as a listener. So how do you do that? Well, I encourage you all to spend some time on my YouTube channel where we not only have full episodes that you can subscribe to, but you can subscribe to our clips, where if you don't have time to listen to entire shows, you can still get some of the best of clips and share those with your friends and family so they get a flavor for what we do here. That's at Brian J. Matos Podcast on YouTube. But if you're a traditional podcast listener, you can find this show on any of your favorite podcast distribution sites, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and others. You can also find this show on my website, brianjmatos.com. We post all of our episodes there. We have some show notes as well, and links to our guests' blogs, their social media channels, their websites, and for those who have either research sites or they're part of larger organizations, we include those links as well. As always, I thank you so much for listening as we continue to grow our global community of curious minds. And until our next episode, this is Brian J. Matos, thanking you all again for listening and hoping and wishing that you will all stay curious.